They told you that if you behaved, if you worked hard, if you followed the path laid out for you, one day, you'd be free. Not today, not next year, but when you turn 65, that's when you'd retire. That's when you'd travel. That's when you'd finally live. But what they didn't tell you is this. By the time you reach that age, your life has already been lived. Not by you, but by someone else's script. For someone else's benefit. You didn't live. You rehearsed. And when they no longer needed your performance, they gave you something called rest. They called it a reward. But Machiavelli would call it what it truly is. A polite termination. A graceful exit strategy for a useful life. You weren't set free. You were phased out. This isn't a video meant to make you comfortable. It's a video meant to wake you up. Because if you still believe that freedom is something given to you, then you haven't understood the first thing about power. Freedom is not a destination, not a reward. It's a decision, a mental state, a quiet act of rebellion. In a world addicted to obedience, Machiavelli once said, "You are under no obligation to be who they told you to be. You must become who they cannot control." And this video, it won't teach you how to retire in comfort. It will show you how to escape the golden cage before it's too late. So let me ask you one question. What version of yourself will you be when the performance ends? It doesn't hit you all at once. It creeps in quietly, like a fog settling over your life. So slowly, you don't even notice it. A dull ache you've learned to carry. You wake up. You get dressed. You go to work. You meet deadlines. You function. And you convince yourself. This is what adults do. But somewhere in the silence between meetings, behind polite smiles, a question begins to whisper. Is this all there is? It's not depression. Not exactly. It's not burnout. Either, it's something more subtle, more dangereux. It's emptiness. With a schedule. A life that looks full on the outside but feels hollow on the inside. You laugh at the right jokes. You check the right boxes. You say you're fine. But your eyes, they've lost their fire. And your mind keeps drifting to a version of yourself you can barely remember. The one who used to dream. This is the hidden pain. The kind no one talks about. The pain of realizing your life has become a maintenance project. You're not building anything. You're not becoming someone. You're just preserving what already is. And beneath all of it, there's a quiet, humiliating truth. You feel replaceable. Not just at work, in your relationships, even in your own mind. You've played the role so well. You don't know who you are without the costume. You've mistaken routine for stability, efficiency for meaning, silence for peace. But silence, when it comes from surrender, is just another form of slow death. You smile on cue. You say, "I'm good." You function. You survive. But you haven't felt alive in years. And the worst part, no one notices. Not because they don't care, but because you've been trained to hide it. You've become a master at appearing fine, at shrinking yourself just enough to go unnoticed, at blending into a life that no longer fits, because performing is safer than confronting the truth. And what is that truth? That the ladder you've been climbing was never leaning on the wall you truly wanted to reach. They told you freedom was coming, but all you feel is tired. Tired of postponing joy. Tired of proving your worth. Tired of pretending that this life belongs to you. But here's what no one ever tells you: that pain you carry. It's not weakness. It's not failure. It's a signal. A quiet rebellion from your soul. A sacred whisper that says, "This isn't who I'm meant to be." And maybe, just maybe, that's the first crack. The fracture that lets the truth seep in. Because before any revolution, before any transformation, there must be discomfort. Not the kind that makes you panic. The kind that makes you think. The kind that makes you pause long enough to finally question the script. And that's where we begin. Not with answers, but with awareness. Because this pain you feel, it's real. And you are not alone. Millions are carrying it, smiling through it, surviving it. But only a few will admit it. And even fewer will do something about it. So now I ask you, not rhetorically, but personally, which one are you? So where does the pain come from? Not just the exhaustion, not just the longing, but that deeper ache, that eerie sense that this life you're living never really felt like yours. To understand that, you have to stop looking at the surface and start seeing the machine. Because whether you know it or not, you were born into one, not made of gears, not of wires, but of scripts, schedules, expectations, roles. From the moment you could speak, they handed you a blueprint. Be quiet. Follow instructions. Don't question authority. Be productive. Be useful. Be safe. And you did. You played your part. School trained you to sit still, to memorize, to obey. Work trained you to trade your time for permission to exist. And somewhere along the way you forgot you were alive. You became efficient, but not whole. Successful, but not free. You were taught to obey structure, not to build one of your own. You were taught to chase approval, but never to ask who designed this game. And why does playing it feel like dying slowly? Because here's the brutal truth. This world you live in was not designed for your fulfillment. It was engineered for your output. Your calendar was never yours. Your energy was leased. Your dreams filtered through quarterly goals and productivity charts. And retirement. Retirement wasn't created to liberate you. It was invented to phase you out quietly. To make room for the next obedient player, the system never asked, "What kind of life do you want?" It asked, "What kind of function can you perform?" And the more you performed, the more your identity fused with your role. Employee, husband, wife, manager, parent, provider, roles, titles, masks. None of them are you, but you clung to them because in this machine, to stop playing a role is to risk disappearing altogether. That's how the system survives, not through violence, but through programming. It teaches you that value equals usefulness, that rest equals laziness, that questioning equals danger. But the most dangerous idea of all, that freedom is earned, that if you work long enough, endure quietly enough, sacrifice everything, one day, they'll hand it back to you. That is the lie. And it's why so many people hit retirement not with joy, but with disorientation, because no one ever taught them how to live, only how to perform. They were given a ladder, but never asked if it was leaning on the right wall. And here's the part that stings the most. Even after the performance ends, the machine isn't done with you. It just shifts your role. From worker to consumer. You become a target demographic, a line in a marketing spreadsheet, a potential buyer for peace sold in monthly installments. They don't sell you freedom. They sell you the illusion of control. Because they know you're terrified of chaos, terrified of silence, terrified of finally meeting the version of you that's been buried under performance for decades. And that's why this channel exists. To break that illusion, to bring you back to yourself, to challenge the system not with rage, but with awareness, with philosophy, with truth. So if something in you remembers, if you've felt the whisper, if you've caught yourself staring at your reflection, wondering where you went, then this is your signal. You don't have to retire from your job to reclaim your life. You have to retire from the script. And that begins now. Let's talk about the traps, the subtle habits, the hidden programs, the invisible strings that keep you stuck in a life that looks functional, but feels empty. Because the system didn't just take your time, it trained your mind to sabotage itself. Here are the 6 most common mistakes, and chances are you're making at least one of them. Mistake number 1, believing that love will heal dysfunction. You think if you give more, if you stay patient, if you just hold on a little longer, they'll change. They'll see you. But here's the truth. Love doesn't fix broken systems, and loyalty doesn't cure manipulation. You keep watering a dead garden because someone told you that suffering makes you virtuous. It doesn't. It makes you easy to exploit. Mistake number 2, over-explaining your worth. You talk too much. To your boss, your partner, your parents, even to strangers. You think if you just explain clearly enough, they'll respect you. But Machiavelli would tell you power lives in silence. The more predictable your thoughts, the less power you hold. Your presence should speak for itself or say nothing at all. Mistake number 3, waiting for closure from the person who hurt you. You think one more conversation, one more explanation, will finally bring peace. But it won't, because closure isn't something they give you. It's something you give yourself. The moment you accept, they were never capable of honesty. You're not waiting for truth. You're avoiding grief, and that delay is destroying you. Mistake number 4, confusing presence with peace. Just because someone stays doesn't mean they bring safety. Familiarity isn't love. Proximity isn't care. Some people remain in your life only to keep you numb. They don't get closer. They just hover just enough to keep you quiet. And now, you're stuck in a proximity prison. Mistake number 5, making excuses for disrespect. They were tired. They were stressed. They didn't mean it. But deep down, you know better. You rationalize behavior that, if reversed, you'd never tolerate, because you were taught that peace means avoiding conflict. Machiavelli would disagree. Sometimes, the most strategic move isn't revenge, isn't argument. It's a clean cut, just silence and distance. Mistake number 6, thinking emotional honesty is always strength. You were told, speak your truth, be vulnerable, let them see the real you. But here's what they didn't tell you: timing is power, and not everyone deserves access to your interior world. Honesty without discernment isn't bravery, it's self-sabotage. Machiavelli warned, never reveal your true intentions unless it serves your purpose. So if you keep bleeding out your truth to people who weaponize it, that's not empowerment. That's emotional suicide. All 6 of these mistakes have one thing in common. They come from waiting. Waiting to be understood. Waiting to be chosen. Waiting for permission to finally choose yourself. But no one's coming. No one is going to hand you your power back. You have to take it. Quietly. Strategically. Without apology. Because in a world addicted to applause, the most radical thing you can do is disappear from the role they wrote for you and begin writing your own. Power is not given. It's taken. Silently. deliberately, often, invisibly. That is the foundation of Machiavelli's philosophy. Not because he was cruel, but because he was clear. In a world addicted to illusions, clarity is dangerous. And Machiavelli was never afraid to see the world as it is. Without the comfort of hope, without the sedative of fantasy. He didn't romanticize people. He studied them. He didn't preach goodness. He analyzed usefulness. Because he understood something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The world doesn't reward truth. It rewards power. And power belongs to those who understand the machine. Let's be honest. Most people don't want truth. They want comfort. They want to be told their suffering is noble, that goodness will be recognized, that obedience will be rewarded. But Machiavelli saw the trap in all of that. He saw how societies were built on myths. The myth of virtue, the myth of freedom, the myth of fairness. He said men forget the death of their father, but never forget the loss of their inheritance. Translation: people will endure anything as long as their comfort remains untouched. They will accept lies. They will tolerate injustice. They will ignore betrayal. As long as the illusion stays intact, this is why the system works. Because it doesn't beat you with chains. It seduces you with patterns. It rewards you for being predictable, for being manageable, for being useful. Take retirement. It's painted as liberation. But it's not freedom. It's a scheduled disappearance. A polished goodbye. A handoff. A systemically approved exit strategy for those who have served long enough to be dismissed with a smile. It's not rebellion. It's replacement. And what does the system give you in return? A watch. A pension. And the false belief that you lived your life on your own terms. But Machiavelli would say, you weren't freed. You were rotated out. You weren't honored. You were phased out gracefully. Because a society built on function must always recycle its performers. And here's where it gets even more dangerous. The system doesn't just control you with rules. It controls you with stories. You were told to be good, to be likable, to be efficient, but never to be sovereign, never to be feared, never to be unreadable. Because a man who is unreadable cannot be managed, and a man who cannot be managed cannot be controlled. Machiavelli understood this perfectly. He said, the appearance of virtue is more powerful than virtue itself. Why? Because perception governs reality more than truth ever has. You can be wise, but if you appear weak, you'll be attacked. You can be kind, but if you appear naive, you'll be used. You can be deeply moral, but if you don't learn strategy, you'll be devoured by those who did. So what's the alternative? Should you become cruel? No. Machiavelli never told you to be cruel. He told you to be strategic. He told you to master the art of detachment, to see clearly without apology, to feel deeply but act precisely. He said, it is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. But here's the nuance everyone misses. He didn't mean terror. He meant leverage. Power isn't about domination. It's about positioning. And that starts with seeing the game for what it is. Let's be honest again. If you measure your worth by how much others need you, you will always be negotiating your value in someone else's currency. And if you seek approval from the system, you will spend your whole life playing roles you were never born to inhabit. Roles that keep you small, predictable, polite, and eventually disposable. Because in this world, if you're not valuable, you're invisible. And if your value is defined by others, they get to decide when it ends. That's why Machiavelli's wisdom matters more today than ever. Because we live in a culture obsessed with noise, with branding, with virtue signaling, but real power Real power is quiet. Real power is strategic. Real power is not in being seen, but in being unmovable. It is the ability to detach from the scripts, to walk through systems untouched, to smile without surrendering, to care without collapsing. And here's where the shift begins. You stop seeking fairness. You start seeking understanding. You stop asking for permission. You start making decisions. You stop waiting for someone to see your worth. You build a life that cannot be overlooked because it doesn't depend on being seen. Machiavelli wouldn't mourn your exhaustion. He'd diagnose it as the natural consequence of playing a game you never agreed to, of investing energy into a performance that was never meant to serve you, of trading your presence for approval. But once you see the machine, you stop worshipping its rewards. You stop explaining your pain. You stop auditioning for recognition. You stop measuring your value in metrics that were never yours. And you begin building something else: inner power, psychological sovereignty, emotional clarity, the kind that doesn't require applause, the kind they cannot take from you, the kind that makes them nervous because they can't read you anymore. And that is the shift from role to presence, from performance to power, from obedience to quiet rebellion. Because in the end, it's not about escaping the system. It's about seeing it so clearly that it can no longer define you. Awakening doesn't arrive with fireworks. It doesn't kick down the door. It seeps in quietly, like water through cracks in a dam you didn't know was breaking. It starts with discomfort. Not panic, not rage, just a subtle fracture in what you thought was solid. You begin to question what once felt normal. The meetings, the deadlines, the chase for approval, the praise that never feels enough. And slowly, the illusion begins to dissolve. You realize something hard, something painful, but liberating. You've been lied to. And worse, you believed it. You believed that loyalty was noble, that obedience was virtue, that exhaustion was a badge of honor. You thought your worth was directly tied to how much of yourself you could sacrifice without making anyone uncomfortable. You called it being responsible. You called it being strong. But it wasn't strength. It was survival. It was a program, because that's what it really is, isn't it? A program. You weren't living. You were rehearsing. You weren't whoosing. You were complying. You were following a path so rehearsed. You began to think it was your own. The 9 to 5, the polite marriage, the vacation once a year that never really feels like rest, the smile you wear like armor, the title that sounds impressive but feels hollow. And now, you're awake enough to feel it. Not free yet, but no longer numb. This is the fracture. Before the revolution, but here's where most people get stuck. They think the shift happens in their schedule. So they change jobs, move cities, buy a course, join a retreat, chase something new. But the real shift, it doesn't begin outside. It begins in orientation. Not in what you do, but in how you see. How you see time. How you see yourself. How you see the roles you were trained to perform. And the first thing you have to see is this: you were not born to be understood. You were born to be whole. And wholeness rarely makes sense to a world built on roles. Most people don't fear death. They fear irrelevance. They fear becoming invisible once they step away from the job title, the relationship status, the applause, the labels, because without the labels, who are you? A dangereuse question, a sacred one, because that's where the shift happens. It happens when you stop performing, when you stop auditioning for love, When you stop begging the world to validate something it was never qualified to measure, it happens when you finally ask, "Who am I?" without the mask. And what if the answer is, "I don't fully know yet"? Good. That means you're on the path. Because the moment you stop knowing, you start discovering. This is not about detachment from people. It's detachment from personas, from the version of you that was shaped by survival, not by truth. The version that explained too much, apologized too fast, said yes too often, smiled when they wanted to scream. That version was not your essence. It was your armor. And at some point, the armor became a prison. So now, the shift becomes this. You stop asking, "What do they need from me?" and start asking, "What do I need to protect within me?" You start choosing discomfort over dishonesty, silence over self-betrayal, sovereignty over social approval. You begin to protect your time like it's sacred currency because it is prevents. You no longer say yes out of guilt. You no longer explain your boundaries. You no longer bleed your truth into hands that never earned your trust. You start walking away, without drama, without a speech, without guilt. Because power doesn't make noise. It makes decisions. You begin to feel stronger. Not when you're loud, but when you're still. And finally, when you no longer need to be seen. That's the paradox of real power. The less you need from the world, the more the world begins to feel your presence. Machiavelli said, "A man who cannot govern himself will always be governed by others." Govern yourself, even when it's lonely, even when no one claps, even when the world begs you to return to the role and the applause you've outgrown. Because that old version of you, the over-explainer, the over-giver, the one who confused sacrifice with love, that version has to die. Not violently, not with bitterness, but with a quiet, final decision. I will no longer negotiate my soul for belonging. And in that moment, freedom begins, not as fireworks, but as stillness. You walk into rooms without needing to be liked. You sit in silence without needing to fill it. You stop seeking approval. You start listening to alignment. You no longer need the system to applaud your growth, because your growth is no longer theirs to measure, and everything changes. Work feels different. Love feels different. Time feels heavier. Silence feels safer. Not because the world changed, but because you did. You stopped waiting. You stopped performing. You stopped explaining. And now, you're simply becoming not someone else, but finally yourself. Awareness is the beginning, but it's not the answer. Because without action, awareness becomes its own kind of prison. A spotlight on your pain, with no exit. That's why philosophy must lead to strategy. Because a sovereign mind without structure is still vulnerable to chaos. So now we shift from knowing the system to dismantling its grip. Let's talk about power. Not theoretical, but practical. Because Machiavelli never stopped at ideas. He gave blueprints. And if you want to be free not just in thought, but in movement, you need architecture. Here's how it begins. 1. Control access, like a fortress. Stop being available to everyone, all the time, for everything. You are not a public resource, not a vending machine for comfort, not a 24/7 therapist for chaos. Machiavelli said, "A wise prince must be both loved and feared, but above all respected, and respect begins at the gate." Your time is not free. Your energy is not unlimited. Your presence is not an entitlement. So start locking the doors. You don't owe a response. You don't owe an explanation. You don't owe availability. The less predictable you are, the more power you hold. Let your silence become a filter. Let your distance become a mirror. 2. Master the timing of your presence. Not every battle is worth your sword. Not every conversation deserves your voice. Not every opportunity is meant for you. Learn when to step back. Learn when to vanish. Because strategic absence is more powerful than constant presence. Machiavelli would call it the art of delayed disruption. You appear late, calculated, intentional, and when you do, the room shifts. Not because you demand it, but because your presence was missed. 3. Speak like a sword, not a river. Most people talk to be liked. You must speak to move. Words are not for decoration. They are weapons. Use fewer of them, and make each one count. Let your pauses speak louder than your paragraphs. Let your silence make people lean in. Because when you speak with precision, people, remember, you don't have to shout. You just have to say the thing that cannot be ignored. 4. Respond with precision, not emotion. Someone crosses a line. Don't explode. Don't explain. Don't negotiate. Respond like a strategist. Sometimes that means a clean exit. Sometimes it means a simple boundary. Sometimes no response at all. Machiavelli warned, a man who cannot control his anger becomes a weapon for his enemies. So control the battlefield. Let your reaction be so measured that it unnerves them. Make your absence louder than your rage. Let your calm feel like a storm they didn't see coming. 5. Become a mirror they cannot read. Stop giving away your psychology. People shouldn't know what moves you, what angers you, what breaks your heart. Because the more they know, the more they can control. Mystery is not manipulation. It's insulation. Let others project. Let them wonder. You are not an open book. You are a coded manuscript. And not everyone deserves to read you. Your depth should not be public domain. It should be earned, or never revealed. 6. Use absence as a weapon. The system trained you to be consistent, to be reliable, to always be there. But presence, when taken for granted, becomes invisible. So, step back. Withdraw. Not in anger. In calibration. Let absence teach what your words could never explain. Because when your presence costs them nothing, your value drops to 0. Let them feel what it's like to not have access to your essence. Let your absence become your most articulate statement. This is not cruelty. This is clarity. You're not punishing the world. You're positioning yourself. You're not disappearing to be missed. You're disappearing to rebuild. Because your energy is not a donation. It's currency. And you're done spending it on people who bankrupt your peace. What does this look like? Really? It looks like closing your phone when someone's chaos becomes your burden. It looks like walking away mid-conversation when you realize you're being emotionally baited. It looks like sitting in silence while others argue to be right. It looks like saying no without adding sorry. It looks like building a life that doesn't require rescue. This is the Machiavellian shift. Not rage, not rebellion, but reconfiguration. You don't scream your boundaries. You enforce them through consistency. You don't announce your growth. You live it through stillness. You don't defend your new self. You embody it through choices. Because people learn faster from absence than they do from explanations. Let your new self be undeniable. Not by noise, but by contrast. And here's the truth. They don't respect what you say. They respect what you walk away from. So walk away from over-explaining, away from chaos, away from the rooms where your soul has to shrink. Because this isn't about vengeance. It's about realignment. The world does not need to understand you. It needs to feel you. And when you become intentional with your presence, strategic with your silence, and ruthless with your access, that's when you stop chasing peace and start protecting power. So what does strength look like once the performance ends? When the applause fades? When the masks fall? When the job title is gone? When no one's watching? And you don't need to impress anyone anymore. Most people imagine strength as loud, visible, dominating. The man who walks into every room and owns it. The woman who outworks everyone around her. The leader who never pauses. The voice that never shakes. But that's not strength. That's anxiety. With a microphone, that's survival. Disguised as power, real strength. Looks nothing like what you were taught. It's not in the noise. It's in the silence. It's not in being liked. It's in being unsharkable. It's not in being everywhere. It's in being deeply rooted exactly where you belong. Strength is not the loudest person in the room. It's the one who no longer needs to prove anything. It looks like this. A man who doesn't explain himself because his life speaks for him. A woman who walks away mid-conversation when disrespect enters the room. A soul who chooses solitude over shallow connection. Who knows that being misunderstood is the price of authenticity. It's not apathy. It's clarity. Not indifference to others, but reverence for your own peace. Because strength isn't just resistance. It's restraint. The man who wants to lash out but breathes instead. The woman who wants to beg for love but closes the door. Quietly. The leader who could destroy but chooses stillness. This is not weakness. This is power. Purified. Pain. Metabolized. Désir. Refined. This is strength forged in fire. Not of dominance, but of discipline. Machiavelli would call this the sovereign self. Not because you rule over others, but because no one rules over you. Not fear. Not guilt. Not loneliness. Not rejection. You've met all four and walked through them without flinching. This kind of strength doesn't need recognition. It recognizes itself. It doesn't beg to be included. It creates a world where inclusion is irrelevant. It doesn't broadcast transformation. It lets presence do the talking. Because when you become sovereign, you no longer speak to convince. You speak to align. Or not at all. You become soft-spoken, but steel-hearted. Unshakable, unmoved, unwilling to perform. You don't raise your voice because you've become the storm that doesn't need thunder. You don't argue because you see that most people don't want truth. They want comfort, and you're done offering yours as a sacrifice. You don't need applause because presence is your reward. You don't fear reaction because solitude no longer scares you. You don't run towards connection. You draw it in through gravity, not by being impressive, but by being impossible to manipulate. You are no longer soft in the ways that break you. You are soft in the ways that bend, but never fall, because stillness is not weakness. Stillness is readiness. The new face of strength is the one that doesn't chase, doesn't explain, doesn't beg to be seen. It's the face of someone who has already buried their old self and now walks through the world. Unbothered by misunderstanding, you no longer ask, "Do they like me?" You ask, "Do I respect how I showed up?" You no longer perform. You embody. You no longer react. You respond if it serves your peace. You no longer try to win because there's nothing left to prove. That is strength, not forged in a gym, not validated by titles, not built on noise, but sculpted in the quiet, tested in loneliness, refined in stillness. It's not something you show off. It's something they feel when you enter the room. And they'll know. Not because of how loud you are, but because of how quiet they become. Machiavelli would say, the greatest strength is the one no one can figure out how to use against you. That is the face of power. Not cruel, not loud, not desperate, but untouchable. You'll know this person when you meet them. They don't rush. They don't fill space. They don't try to be right. But their presence, it rearranges the energy in the room. People don't understand why, they just feel it. The calm, the gravity, the refusal to be shaped by noise, and the beautiful part, you don't need to force this version of you. It arrives once the old version dies. The one that begged, that over-explained, that twisted itself into shapes just to be loved. You don't need that anymore. You outgrew it. Or maybe you outlived it. This new strength doesn't rise with noise. It emerges in the stillness, like steel beneath the skin. Not armor, but structure, not defense, but design. And when someone tries to provoke you, they find nothing to push against. Just calm, just clarity, just a wall they cannot climb. That is the new face of strength. The one that doesn't fight to be free because it already is. The one that doesn't demand space because it has already claimed it. Within. The one that no longer waits to be chosen because it already chose itself. Quietly. Finally. Irrevocably. So you made it. You followed the rules. You played your role. You worked. You sacrificed. You postponed your joy. You endured what others couldn't. And now finally they tell you, it's your time. Time to relax. Time to rest. Time to live. But here's the question. No one dares to ask, whose version of freedom are you living now? Because the trap didn't disappear. It just changed its costume. You no longer clock in, but you still follow a schedule. You still play a role. You're still a participant in a system that sells peace like a product. Look around. The retirement brochures, the cruise packages, the investment portfolios, the beachfront property dreams. They don't look like traps. They look like rewards. But Machiavelli would see them for what they are. A managed illusion. You're not free. You're simply being handled more gently, more politely. Not as a worker, but as a consumer. You're no longer expected to produce. Now, you're expected to purchase. And that's not liberation. That's rebranding. Think about it. All your life, you were told what to chase: grades, jobs, promotions, pensions. And once you reach the end of that race, they offer you a new finish line. Now, enjoy yourself. But you were never taught how. You were taught to work, to please, to sacrifice, to perform. But no one ever taught you how to live. So now, in your so-called freedom, you find yourself uncomfortable in silence. You fill your calendar again. This time with hobbies, events, bucket list goals. But underneath it all, there's a strange emptiness. Because you're still rehearsing, just with nicer costumes, and that's the trap. You didn't escape. You just redecorated the cage. Now, the chains look like comfort. The routine looks like peace. But your soul knows the difference. Deep down, you still feel it. Something is missing. Not because you're ungrateful, but because you've never had the space to meet yourself outside of productivity. You were never shown how to be without being useful. So now you scroll catalogs instead of spreadsheets. You analyze flight deals instead of deadlines. You plan holidays instead of projects. It looks like freedom, but it feels like disorientation, because structure was your cage, but it was also your identity. And without it, you don't know who you are. That's what the system counts on. Here's the brutal truth. You weren't programmed to retire. You were programmed to obey. And retirement is just the final role in the performance. They don't need you to produce anymore. Now, they need you to remain predictable, to take your meds, to pay your dues, to not question anything, because nothing scares the system more than someone who wakes up after they're no longer useful. Someone who says, wait, if this isn't freedom, what is? Machiavelli warned. The people are easiest to control when they mistake the illusion of choice for actual power. That's exactly what this is. You were given choices, but all within the same box. You can retire in Spain or Florida. You can invest in stocks or real estate. You can rest, but only if you pay for the right package. It's not freedom. It's a well-decorated maze, and most people will live out their final years thinking they've escaped while they're still running in circles. Here's the part no one wants to admit. When you stop working, you don't automatically start living. You simply lose the distraction that once numbed the ache. And unless you confront that ache, you'll spend your last decades trying to entertain yourself out of existential dread. Trips, games, shopping, scrolling. It all feels deserved. And maybe it is. But it's not freedom. Freedom has no price tag, no monthly plan, no itinerary. True freedom begins the moment you stop needing the system to tell you when it's your turn. Because if you wait for permission to live, you'll die. Rehearsing. You'll die clinging to schedules, to roles, to the illusion of safety. They've sold you since childhood, and that's why this part of the journey is so dangerous. Because you think you made it. You think you won. But all that happened was a quiet surrender. You traded one performance for another, one identity for another, and now you're too tired to question it. That's what they wanted, but not you. Because if you're here, listening to this, it means something inside you is still alive. Still questioning, still searching, and that's all you need. Not a vacation, not a retirement plan. You need the courage to look in the mirror and say, I'm not done. Not with the world, not with myself, not with what I came here to become. Because you weren't born for polite endings. You were born for truth. And even if you only start living in your final chapters, that is still a revolution. So what is it? What is freedom really? If it's not retirement, if it's not a condo on the beach, if it's not passive income, early mornings, or finally being left alone, then where is it? Is it in travel, minimalism, financial independence? No, those are outcomes, circumstances, byproducts. Freedom is something else entirely. Something no one can package. Something no system can sell. Because freedom is not external. It's internal. Alan Watts once said, "You are under no obligation to be who you were 5 minutes ago." That is freedom. Not a lifestyle, but a capacity. The capacity to change without permission, to speak without fear, to rest without guilt, to walk away without a speech. It's not about what you own or where you live. It's about how much of yourself is under your own command. Freedom is the moment you stop asking, "Is this allowed?" and start asking, "Is this true?" It's when your decisions are no longer shaped by guilt, shame, or fear of what others will think. It's when your silence no longer comes from submission but from sovereignty. It's when your presence is no longer an accident but a decision. Most people never find that freedom because they were trained to mistake peace for stillness, obedience for goodness, and comfort for safety. They were told, follow the steps, work hard, retire one day, then you'll be free. But no one told them how to break the script, because freedom can't be scheduled. It can't be bought. It can't be waited for. It must be claimed. Now, in the middle of the system, in the middle of the noise, in the middle of the fear, you don't find freedom after everything settles. You find it when you decide internally to stop participating in illusions. You stop explaining your silence. You stop apologizing for your decisions. You stop chasing connection that costs you your clarity. You begin to own yourself. Fully. Finally. Quietly. And something radical begins to happen. You stop craving validation. Because you've met yourself. And finally approved. You stop rehearsing your worth. Because your presence is no longer for sale. You stop managing your image. Because truth is cleaner than performance. And what do you gain? Everything. Your time, your dignity, your energy, your breath. Not the breath you take to survive. The breath you take when you're finally unburdened. You begin to notice things. How your body used to tense before you spoke your truth. How your smile would appear before your soul agreed. How your dreams were constantly filtered through what's realistic, what's safe, what's acceptable. And you realize you weren't living. You were surviving politely. Now, you arrive in your own life, fully. You eat slowly. You speak less. You listen more. You no longer tolerate noise disguised as intimacy. You no longer fear being misunderstood. Because freedom doesn't require consensus. It requires alignment. And when you find it not in a plan, not in a bank account, but in your nervous system, you don't need to convince anyone. You don't need to announce it. You just move differently. You say no without resentment. You say yes without collapse. You leave rooms without slamming doors. You don't need revenge. You don't need closure. You don't need anyone to understand why you chose yourself. Because you understand. And that's enough. This is the kind of freedom they never wanted you to find. Because it makes you immune to the games. It makes you untouchable. You can still participate in the world. But the world no longer dictates your choices. You can still serve, but not from sacrifice. You can still love, but not from fear. You become calm, not because life is easy, but because your alignment is no longer negotiable. Machiavelli would say, "The man who sees the machine and no longer worships its rewards is the most dangerous man alive." Because you can't manipulate someone who no longer needs to be praised. You can't threaten someone who is already at peace with solitude. You can't bribe someone who's no longer performing. That is real freedom, and it's waiting. Not at the end of your career. Not when the market is stable. Not when your parents finally understand you. Not when you've healed everything. Now, in this breath, in this moment, you don't need permission. You don't need perfection. You just need presence. So stop rehearsing. Stop postponing. Stop waiting to be ready. Because the moment you stop waiting and start deciding, everything changes. You were never meant to be programmed. You were meant to be free. So here we are, not at the end, but at the edge, The edge of the life they assigned to you. The edge of the script you followed so well you almost forgot it wasn't yours. But now, you know, retirement was not freedom. It was permission. Permission to vanish. Quietly, conveniently, without making a mess. But you didn't come here to vanish. You came here to awaken. And now, the real question is no longer, when will you live? It's this: will you ever stop waiting? Because no one's coming. Not with permission. Not with applause. Not with a map. There is no map. There is only now. Now to choose your voice over their silence. Your truth over their script. Your breath over their timeline. You are the map. You are the standard. You are the permission slip. And the moment you stop asking is the moment you begin. Drop the role. Return to the real. Detach from the applause. Detach from the timelines. Become something more dangerous than successful. Become Zovine. Not because you're perfect, but because nothing owns you anymore. Not fear. Not approval. Not failure. Not legacy. You walk not to impress. Not to prove. Not to explain. You walk because you've remembered who you are when no one else is looking. That is the kind of freedom no government can regulate. No paycheck can offer. No retirement can deliver. Because sovereign freedom is never scheduled. It is chosen in silence, in defiance, in presence. This moment, not someday, not after they understand, not after you feel ready. Now. So if this message awakens something in you, something raw, unapologetic, and quietly powerful, then support this work. Click super thanks below. Comment, I no longer wait to be free. Share this with someone still asleep inside the system. Because this isn't just a channel. It's a rebellion. A quiet revolution of minds that refuse to be programmed. Let them feel the silence. Let them question the structure. Let them remember, they were never meant to be controlled. Only free.